I watched as flames consumed my cherished Victorian home, feeling a mix of loss and frustration. My neighbor Karen was nearby, sipping her coffee with an air of triumph. She thought she had won our ongoing conflict, not realizing that I hold a position of authority that could drastically affect her life. How much more would she provoke me before I chose to reveal who I truly am? It began like any other morning, with me enjoying coffee on my grandmother's porch swing, savoring the sight of the sun rising and casting a rosy glow over the house's distinctive purple trim. That's when I noticed Karen Thompson making her way to my mailbox, envelope in hand, her demeanor suggesting she believed it held great importance. I had seen that same determination in her during our neighborhood meetings, held at her recently renovated mansion next door. As she deposited the envelope into my mailbox and snapped photos of my front yard, I felt a knot form in my stomach. My grandmother's roses were in full bloom, their untamed beauty contrasting sharply with Karen's meticulously trimmed boxwood hedges. She had always disapproved of any imperfection in the neighborhood. Inside the envelope was a so-called exciting opportunity, an invitation to join her newly formed homeowners association, complete with a shiny brochure featuring uniform beige houses and matching mailboxes. The price tag was steep, a $5,000 membership fee and $350 monthly dues. But it wasn't just the cost that unsettled me. It was the attached list of mandatory property modifications. This included orders to repaint my grandmother's cherished purple trim, replace the heritage rose garden with her preferred plants, and even remove the antique wind chimes that had been a comforting presence in my life since childhood. I watched Karen through my window as she returned home, phone to her ear, reporting on her final invitation to me. Her voice dripped with insincerity as she claimed, "Once we get her property in line, this neighborhood's value will skyrocket." Her tone was unsettling, filled with a false charm that made me uneasy. Later that evening, I found myself at her door, invitation in hand. The doorbell played a cheerful rendition of "We Are the Champions," which felt all too fitting. She answered, proudly wearing a neighborhood watch captain badge, a wide smile on her face that I could tell was meant to be welcoming. "I've reviewed your invitation," I said, keeping my tone even and calm, drawing on my years of experience. "I have to decline. This house has been in my family for 3 generations. I want to keep the historic character of my home," but Karen's demeanor shifted quickly. Her smile faded faster than free cookies at a bake sale. "You don't understand," she said, leaning in. "This isn't really an invitation. The HOA is already established here, and your property is surrounded by its members. You need to join." I pulled out the property maps I had researched earlier that day. "Actually, that's not correct," I replied. "My deed predates any HOA agreements, so I have no legal obligation to join." Years of legal experience had shown me the importance of being prepared. Karen's face changed color, taking on a deep shade of red. "Listen here," she hissed, dropping her friendly facade. "This neighborhood is changing. Progress is happening. If you don't get with the program, things might get difficult." She continued, "Accidents can happen to houses that don't meet code. Citations get filed, and fines will add up." I met her gaze firmly. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Thompson?" She stepped back, her sugary smile back in place. "Of course not. I'm just worried about your property values and safety. Old houses like yours can have all sorts of unpredictable issues. Electrical problems, structural concerns. It would be terrible if something were to happen because you refuse to modernize." Behind her, I spotted her husband watching us through the window, phone in hand. His posture made me feel uneasy. I nodded politely and began to walk away, but Karen called after me. "You have 1 week to reconsider before the HOA board meets to discuss enforcement options." As I walked home, I noticed unfamiliar faces peering out from their windows, probably Karen's allies from the HOA. Something told me this wasn't going to end with a simple decline of an invitation. That night, I set up security cameras around my property to document everything. I had learned long ago to trust my instincts, and they were screaming that Karen Thompson was just getting started. What I didn't yet realize was that this conflict stretched beyond property values or the color of my trim. In 3 decades of dealing with difficult personalities, I had never encountered anyone like Karen. As I drifted off to sleep, Lulled by the gentle sound of my grandmother's wind chimes, I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a struggle that would change everything. My beloved Victorian home would become the first casualty in this ongoing battle. But Karen had made one crucial mistake in choosing her target. She just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I was jolted awake by her sharp voice outside my window. "Look at those hideous purple trim." I peeked through my curtains to see Karen leading a group of HOA members on what they called their morning inspection. My heart sank as I watched them photograph every corner of my grandmother's cherished home. I tried to enjoy my morning coffee on the porch, but their whispers carried across the lawn. "Did you see those old wind chimes? They're not HOA approved," one member remarked. "And those roses? They're 3 inches taller than the rules allow." Every day brought new complaints, each more absurd than the last. They started leaving bright orange warning letters taped to my door, citing violations that had never existed before. Suddenly, my grandmother's heritage rose garden became a neighborhood eyesore. The authentic Victorian purple trim that tourists loved to photograph became their latest target. One Tuesday morning, I stepped outside to find Karen measuring my grass with a ruler. 11.5 inches! She exclaimed, turning to her sidekick Barbara, who was busily jotting things down. "That's 3.5 inches over code." I calmly sipped my coffee and stated, "You're trespassing on private property." I knew my legal rights, but I kept my profession to myself. Karen just smirked and took more pictures. Their harassment took on new forms. They started scheduling landscapers to arrive at 7 a.m. on Saturdays. Their equipment seemed to be the loudest right by my bedroom window. Anonymous complaints to code enforcement became a weekly event. Yet each time, I calmly showed the officials the historic status documentation of my property, watching Karen fume from her window. Then came the psychological tactics. Karen organized HOA meetings right in her driveway, just outside my home office. I would hear them discuss how some people were diminishing the neighborhood's reputation and how certain houses needed to be dealt with for everyone's good. My security cameras picked up on their attempts to test my patience. They would let their dogs use my yard as a bathroom and then feign shock when I showed them the footage. "Oh, my precious Bentley would never," Karen gasped, clutching her pearls, while her large golden doodle left yet another mess on my lawn. The breaking point arrived during their annual block party. Of course, I wasn't invited, but I could hear Karen loudly discussing plans to revitalize the neighborhood. She glanced toward my house and declared, "Some of these older properties just don't fit our community vision anymore." That's when I caught sight of people taking photos of my home. As I sat quietly, documenting my home's structural issues, I maintained my calm demeanor. I wrote down every detail, cataloging letters, photos, and anonymous complaints in a careful manner. When the Homeowners Association, HOA, installed bright security lights aimed at my bedroom windows, I noted this addition of light pollution to my growing collection of evidence. My grandmother taught me the value of patience, and as I observed Karen's group growing bolder, I recognized that timing would be key. That evening, while reviewing my security footage, I noticed something unsettling. 2 HOA board members were closely inspecting the markers that defined my property line, whispering about easement regulations. I could tell they had something planned. However, they were unaware that I had spent my professional life handling people who believed they were above the law. As I turned off my porch light that night, I watched Karen's group gather in her driveway. I pondered how long I should wait before showing them the consequences of their actions. To my surprise, I found Karen and 2 board members skulking around my property in the middle of the night. They were caught in the glow of my kitchen light while I got up for a glass of water. My heart raced as I spotted the chemical sprayers they were carrying, pointed directly at my grandmother's century-old rose garden. "What do you think you're doing?" I called from my porch, already recording the scene. Karen jumped at the sound, but quickly composed herself, forcing a smile that felt anything but genuine. "Oh, we're just helping to eliminate these invasive species," she said sweetly, continuing to spray my cherished roses. "The HOA has strict rules about non-native plants. If you just join us, we could handle these issues properly." I stepped closer, my blood boiling, but kept my voice steady. Those aren't invasive species, Karen. They're heritage Victorian roses planted by my grandmother in 1960. I have the original documentation and Gardening Society registration to prove it. The other board members looked uncomfortable, but Karen stood firm. Well, someone complained about the smell, she said while adjusting her designer pajamas, and these thorns are a safety hazard for children walking by on my private property. I switched on my security lights, asserting, "The property line is clearly marked, and you're trespassing." That's when Bob, Karen's husband, stepped out from the shadows. As a retired police sergeant, he believed he could intimidate anyone. Now let's not throw around accusations. We're just trying to maintain neighborhood standards, he said. I wanted to enjoy my space next to the jungle, but I noticed Mrs. Watson, my elderly neighbor across the street, peeking through her curtains. Last month, she had been pressured to join the Homeowners Association, HOA. The lovely rock garden she tended to was quickly replaced with the bland shrubs that the HOA approved. The next morning, I discovered that my beautiful roses had wilted overnight, their once vibrant petals now black and shriveled. It became clear that Karen, the HOA leader, had made a significant misstep. She accidentally exposed their method of targeting homeowners who resisted joining the HOA. Curious about this pattern, I spent my lunch break at the county records office, where I found a troubling trend. In nearly every case, homeowners who initially said no to the HOA faced mysterious accidents or code violations, often leading them to sell their homes. Determined to protect my own property, I installed high-definition security cameras in my remaining flower beds that afternoon. Later that evening, I saw Karen showing potential buyers around my property. "This issue will be resolved soon," she announced loudly, claiming they had ways to deal with difficult residents. From that point on, my life turned into a nuisance. My mailbox was knocked over 3 times, and anonymous noise complaints were filed on days when I wasn't even home. Code enforcement officers visited daily but found nothing wrong, yet they kept coming back. My garbage bins disappeared, only to turn up later to accuse me of HOA rule violations. I kept careful records of all these events, building my case quietly. Meanwhile, Karen and her group became increasingly bold, holding HOA meetings right in front of my house and pointing out every minor flaw to potential new residents. "This property is driving down home values," she would declare, waving her designer handbag for emphasis, all while reassuring everyone that it wouldn't be a problem for long. Everything escalated when I caught them tampering with my historic fence posts. They pretended to measure the sidewalk while loosening the posts. My security cameras captured Karen instructing her followers that once these posts failed inspection, I would have to replace the whole fence with one of their approved models. That would cost me thousands unless I joined the HOA. That night, as I reviewed the footage, I noticed something odd. The HOA's inspection team always included someone photographing my electrical boxes, gas lines, and other utilities. They were systematically documenting every potential vulnerability of my home. Why were they doing this? The pieces started to fall into place, and the picture they formed sent a chill through me. I realized I needed to act quickly, but I had to be cautious about revealing my plans. What I didn't realize at that moment was that Karen had already begun a plan that would alter everything. It was a plan that would bring all my fears to the surface. My hands shook as I read the morning paper and saw the headline announcing that I had just sentenced a corrupt contractor to prison. The courtroom was eerily quiet when my clerk, Emily, burst in, her face pale. "Your Honor, your house is on fire." Those words froze me in place. I threw off my robe and rushed down the courthouse steps, my heart racing. 15 minutes to drive home felt like an eternity. I could see the black smoke from several blocks away, and a chill settled in my stomach. The beautiful purple trim, which my grandmother had lovingly painted, was engulfed by angry flames. When I finally skidded to a stop in front of my home, firefighters were already battling the blaze. The heat hit me hard as I heard the old wooden beams creaking under the flames. Everything my family had built over 3 generations was disappearing before my eyes. Through my tears, I spotted Karen in her driveway, dressed in expensive yoga pants, casually sipping her coffee as if she were just watching a morning show. Her perfectly styled blonde hair glistened in the sunlight while she chatted with other members of the homeowners association, her satisfaction palpable as they pointed and whispered about the burning house. Fire Chief Martinez approached me, his expression serious. "Ma'am, it appears to be an electrical fire. These old homes can have dangerous wiring." But I knew better. Just yesterday I had completed my annual electrical inspection. Everything was up to code. I had made sure of that, especially after Karen's complaints about historic properties at the last town meeting. Then the realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. My security cameras. I fumbled for my phone, hands trembling as I accessed the footage. The screen was blank. The cameras had stopped recording at exactly 3 a.m., just 4 hours before the fire started. This was no accident. As I watched my home burn, memories flooded my mind. Baking cookies in the kitchen with Grandma, celebrating my law school graduation in the garden, my first day as a judge, all going up in smoke because I refused to give in to Karen's demands about joining her precious HOA. As I looked around, I recognized two familiar faces in the crowd. Bob Johnson and Mike Peters, both members of the HOA board. They seemed to be trying to blend in, but their work boots caught my attention. I remembered those boots from the security footage I had reviewed last week, shortly after the vandalism of my rose bushes. Now they were stained, possibly with fresh mud, or maybe something else entirely. Then Karen approached, wearing a facade of feigned concern. "This is just terrible," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "If only you would join our HOA. We have such strict safety requirements." She lingered on the word historic, as if it were something unsavory. I felt the urge to respond but held back, biting my tongue hard enough to taste blood. It wasn't the right time to reveal my thoughts. While she took a deliberate sip of her coffee, I noticed her quickly typing something on her phone. Nearby, another neighbor mentioned a remarkable deal on a premium piece of land that had just been listed to an exclusive real estate group. The fire department had finally managed to extinguish the flames, but by then, it was already too late. The stunning Victorian windows were shattered, the hand-carved porch railings were beyond recognition, and part of the roof had collapsed. In just a few hours, a century's worth of history was ruined. Watching the smoke curl into the morning sky, I came to a realization. Karen believed she had won this round, that she had somehow broken me. Little did she know, she had made a significant mistake. I pulled out my phone and made 3 important calls, one to a friend at the FBI, another to my contact at the state attorney's office, and the third to a private investigator I trusted. Karen noticed me making those calls, and for a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. She didn't know who I was contacting, but my determined posture must have given her pause. Good. Let her worry. While my house lay in ruins, my true strength came from my pursuit of justice, not from material possessions. As the sun climbed higher, I picked up a small piece of the charred purple trim. My grandmother had always said that sometimes you had to lose everything to gain the strength to fight back. Glancing at Karen's smug expression one last time, I understood precisely what I had to do next. First, though, I needed to dig deeper and uncover just how far the HOA's corruption extended. Standing amidst the ashes of my grandmother's home, I made a promise to turn my sorrow into determination. Meanwhile, Karen was busy spreading rumors that I had burned my own house down. But that wouldn't stop me. It was time to take action. I had a quiet ambition. I was uncovering the layers of a scheme that threatened to unravel an entire empire. It all started when an old friend from law school, now a real estate investigator, pointed out something unusual. Over the last 5 years, every house that had burned down mysteriously in our county had been sold to the same shell company owned by Karen's sister-in-law. My heart raced as I began to dig deeper into property records. Each page I turned revealed a connection too striking to be a mere coincidence. To proceed further, I hired a private investigator who spoke to former neighbors who had lost their homes. Their stories echoed my own. They described a chilling pattern: join the homeowners association, or face intimidation, harassment, and eventually accidents or fires. Many had been forced to sell their homes at a fraction of their value to Karen's investment group. One elderly man, visibly shaken, recounted how he had lost his family photos in a garage fire that occurred the very day after he declined to join the HOA. A breakthrough came unexpectedly from Karen's former assistant treasurer. She reached out to me through my lawyer and, over coffee at a quiet diner 2 towns away, handed me a USB drive. It contained 5 years' worth of HOA financial records. Her hands shook as she explained how Karen had pressured her into manipulating the financials, threatening to expose her undocumented status if she refused. The documents revealed hundreds of thousands of dollars in dubious cash deposits following each suspicious fire. Sleepless nights followed as I worked to connect the dots. Karen's husband wasn't just a retired police officer. He was the fire investigator. Each questionable blaze within their jurisdiction had been quickly labeled as an accident, with no further inquiries made. As a result, the insurance companies had dispersed millions based on his reports. My security cameras recorded more than just potential arsonists. They captured weekly meetings at Karen's home with real estate developers eager to plan luxury condos where our historic houses once stood. One developer even bragged about bribing city officials to change zoning laws as they gathered more properties. As I delved further into the patterns, it became clear Karen targeted homes in prime locations, especially historic properties that couldn't be easily replicated. She'd utilize HOA rules to intimidate owners, then escalate to vandalism and threats. If those tactics failed, mysterious accidents would follow. Her group was always ready to swoop in and buy the distressed properties for a fraction of their true worth. As I worked late one night, the pieces began to fall into place. Karen had a pattern. She had already targeted 3 other historic neighborhoods in nearby counties using the same tactic. She would move in, lead an HOA, push out homeowners who resisted her plans, and then sell the consolidated properties to developers for a hefty profit. Ironically, she had even received community service awards for her so-called neighborhood improvements. The evidence against her was considerable, but I needed more to build my case. To strengthen our efforts, I convinced the FBI to wiretap the former treasurer during a meeting with Karen. The recording revealed everything. Karen was bragging about her next targets, joking about which houses might have electrical issues, and even making threats about what would happen if the treasurer ever spoke out. Each day, I watched Karen move through the neighborhood, confidently plotting her next step, completely unaware that I was carefully constructing my case against her. Every smug wave she offered or phony display of sympathy regarding my personal tragedies was being recorded. Her overconfidence would ultimately be her undoing. The final piece of evidence fell into place when I unearthed a hidden map in the city archives that showed a planned highway expansion. It became clear that Karen's developer friends had insider information. My property was crucial to their plans for a new shopping complex. They had already purchased the surrounding land through shell companies, but my house was the key. Without it, their entire multi-million-dollar project would crumble. As I assembled the evidence for the FBI, Karen's desperation was palpable. She started filing daily complaints about my property, which was now just a burned shell. Boldly, she even suggested a special HOA assessment to beautify my lot, a proposal that would conveniently line her own pockets. Little did she realize that each of her moves only fortified my case. I stood outside the community center, my heart racing as I watched Karen stride in, coffee mug in hand and a stack of papers under her arm. Tonight's HOA meeting was going to be different. After 6 months of meticulous planning, I was ready to show her who she had been dealing with all along. Through the window, I could see her preparing her PowerPoint presentation, likely filled with more doctored violation photos and imaginary rules. My hands shook slightly as I adjusted my judicial robes, neatly folded in my briefcase. The weight of the FBI wire under my blazer reminded me that everything had to go smoothly. The property at 247 Maple Street has been declared a public nuisance. Karen's voice boomed through the room as I quietly prepared for the confrontation ahead. I opened the door as part of our emergency plans, announcing that we would be moving forward with immediate redevelopment efforts. A wave of confused whispers washed over the room, filled with neighbors who were decent folks but too intimidated to confront her. They shifted uncomfortably in their plastic chairs. Any objections? Karen asked, a smirk playing on her lips as she scanned the room with sharp eyes. No one responded. Well then, let me show you our exciting plans. Just then I interrupted. I object, Mrs. Thompson. My voice broke through the tension, and every head turned toward me. I walked calmly down the aisle, my heels clicking on the linoleum floor. For a moment, Karen's smirk faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. Ah, finally here to accept defeat? That burned-out house of yours really is an eyesore. We're doing you a favor, she said, taking a long sip from her coffee mug, a smug smile still on her face. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Actually, I'm here to present some evidence of my own. I opened the folder and spread photos across the table. These security cameras clearly show you and your board members on my property the night of the fire. Interesting timing, wouldn't you agree? Karen's expression shifted and she responded, Those could be anyone. Besides, you can't prove it. Oh, but I can, I replied, pulling out more documents. They included bank records revealing suspicious payments to your shell company following each troubled property sale, emails outlining your plans to oust members, and my personal favorite, texts discussing how to ensure the electrical fire looked like an accident. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. I noticed Karen's hands begin to shake as coffee spilled over the rim of her mug. This is ridiculous, she protested. You can't just waltz in here with these wild accusations. I'll sue for defamation. That was my chance. I reached back into my briefcase one last time and pulled out my judicial robes. The silk fabric unfolded dramatically as I put them on. Federal Judge Sarah Martinez, I announced, watching the color drain from Karen's face. Currently presiding over case number 2025, CR 142, United States versus Thompson et al., a RICO investigation into corruption, fraud, and conspiracy. Her coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor as hot liquid splashed on her designer shoes, but she didn't even seem to notice. Her mouth moved soundlessly, like a fish out of water. FBI, came the call, and right on cue, agents burst through both doors, badges raised. Karen's husband blanched. A retired police sergeant who had buried all those police reports, attempted to escape through the emergency exit, but didn't get far. Just 3 steps in, he was tackled. I approached Karen, who had slumped into her beloved president's chair, and said, You know what the biggest mistake criminals make? They get so consumed by their own power that they forget who they're actually dealing with. I picked up the gavel she had used to sentence my home to ruin. With the click of handcuffs, the FBI led Karen and her board members away, and my neighbors erupted in applause. Years of fear and intimidation had finally been shattered. As I gathered my evidence, Mrs. Leck Johnson from across the street came over and hugged me, tears in her eyes. We should have helped you fight them, she whispered. I embraced her back, my gaze on Karen being escorted to a waiting police car. Sometimes I quietly reflected, justice takes a winding path to ensure it reaches its rightful destination. The morning of the trial felt different. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror, I adjusted my judge's robe, recalling how Karen had laughed when my house burned. Now, that laughter was gone. The courtroom buzzed with neighbors, reporters, and victims from other neighborhoods who had come forward after our story aired on local news. Karen entered, dressed in an expensive suit rather than her usual yoga pants, but her face went pale when she spotted me at the bench. I'll always remember how she clutched her lawyer's arm and whispered, That's her, the one whose house we burned. Her lawyer dropped his pen in disbelief. The evidence we presented was shocking. Our investigation revealed 15 other homes that mysteriously caught fire after refusing to join Karen's HOA. The pattern was consistent: harassment, vandalism, and then fire. They would buy the burned properties for a fraction of their value through a shell company run by Karen's brother-in-law. They had already made millions doing this. When we played the security footage from my cameras, gasps filled the courtroom as everyone watched Karen and her HOA friends dousing gasoline around my grandmother's rose bushes at 2 a.m. Karen, visibly shaken, kept shaking her head, mouthing no, even as her own words echoed through the speakers. Once it burns, she'll have to sell. The real twist came when her husband, that retired police sergeant, decided to turn against her. He had stayed silent out of loyalty, but seeing the evidence was enough to change his mind. They had everything planned out: how to choose their targets, how to bribe local officials to turn a blind eye. In the courtroom, Karen's voice rang out, calling someone a liar so loudly that her friend had to pull her back. One by one, people shared their stories. Mrs. Rodriguez, a retired teacher, recounted how her family photos were lost. The Patel family spoke about how their grandfather's ashes were destroyed. With each tale, Karen seemed to shrink in her chair, and her expensive suit couldn't disguise her fear. When I read the verdict, I felt steady as I pronounced the sentences. 25 years for Karen and 15 for each board member. Their expressions revealed a realization. They understood that no amount of money could shield them from justice. Karen attempted to justify her actions, claiming she was safeguarding property values, but I interrupted, just as she had done to dismiss my explanations about my grandmother's roses months earlier. Fast forward 6 months, and I'm watching construction workers put the final touches on my restored Victorian house. The purple trim matches exactly how Grandma envisioned it, and the rose garden is rejuvenating with cuttings from the lone surviving bush. Karen's house was sold to compensate the victims, and now a lovely immigrant family calls it home. Their children play in the yard where Karen once stood, taking snapshots of my supposed violations. Our new neighbors formed a genuine community, not just a homeowners association, but a group that truly supports each other. We host block parties in my garden, with everyone contributing food and sharing stories. Just yesterday, Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous empanadas and showed me the family photos that her daughter had managed to restore from the damaged albums. Sometimes, while tending to my garden, people stop to thank me, not for my role as a judge, but for standing up to bullies. The local news even did a piece on our transformation from a neighborhood once ruled by fear to a supportive community. They interviewed the Patels, who now host our monthly meetings in their lovely backyard. On my desk at the courthouse, I keep Karen's coffee cup, the one she dropped when she first recognized me. It serves as a reminder that justice may take time, but it arrives, just as my grandmother always said. Each morning, I enjoy my coffee in my rose garden, watching the sunrise through the perfectly trimmed windows, knowing that sometimes the best way to respond to destruction is by creating something even more beautiful.